Are you struggling with dynamic queries? Well, it's time to learn how to use the WithBinds database method. In this video, I'm going to go over how to use these methods with some practical examples. Big shout out to Lisa from Cloud Code Academy, who was kind of struggling with this, and I decided to make a video about it. As always, if you want to look at the code, we have a GitHub repository linked in the description. Let's jump into it. The queryWithBinds database method really helps you make dynamic SOQL a lot easier. It allows you to pass in your query parameters, a few bind variables, or I guess a bind map, which you send in a string and an object. We'll take a look at that. And then the access level of the query that you want to run. This can be very important because, as we kind of remember, Salesforce and Apex runs in system context, but you can use the different access levels to change the permissions of the query that is running to potentially get back more or less records depending on what you actually need. Let's jump back and really quickly in the documentation, kind of look at an example, and it can be a little confusing taking a look at it for the first time. You have this map and we're setting the queries and all of that stuff. So let's actually take a look at this inside of our VS Code to get a better breakdown, a more visual breakdown. What we have set up here is setting the initial query parameters that we want to enter in. So we'll set these bind variables, we create a map, and then you add in the different values that you want to transfer over into the query. Next up, I just have it lined up with the actual query itself. So we're selecting from our opportunity with a bunch of different fields in here. In the where clause, a lot of the magic is happening where we're actually setting our bind variables. And once we use our query with binds, it's going to pick up these values. The key here is that we're actually using this database method query with binds, and we're setting all of our values through the parameters. So what this is doing is sending in our query that we have in here, the different bind variables that we have. So opportunity, the string opportunity amount is going to match up with this bind variable inside of here. And the amount is automatically being set above. We'll take a look at that. And then also the stage, right? So the stage is matching up inside of here. All of that is going to run in user mode, or as the current user's access, it's not going to be elevated to a different level of access. And then, of course, I'm just printing a few things out. So let's actually try this out over here just to see what we get. And then we'll take a step back to kind of see how we got here. Really quickly, we see that this executes successfully, right? We've got our entire printout over here, and we are getting back in that debug statement of the size of our list. We're getting back 24 records, which is really cool. So all of this is actually working, but let's kind of take a look at some of why this is really useful for the overall process. Taking a look at a normal SOQL query that we would make, we've got our select statements just like before, from, opportunities, and then our amounts. And all of these values are kind of hard coded inside of here, which can work out if we know exactly what we need. And let's just run this query really quickly. If we don't know what we need in the beginning, then these types of SOQL queries won't work out really well. So that's looking good. And if we even if we remove this value, we see how we can add and remove values with traditional SOQL queries. We literally have to go into the query and add the values in manually as they're going along. So once again, this is fine if we know what values we're going to be working with, and we can even make these bind variables, right, by adding in the little semicolon and then the name of the variable, so we can see that these are matching up over here for the stage name and all of that stuff. So let's save this again and execute it, and everything should look very similar to the WithBinds query that we just ran before. Let's execute this over here and see what we get. We've got 24 and a whole bunch of opportunities coming through. So this is a traditional query. It works out fairly well if we know how everything is working. But let's start to kind of use more dynamic querying, and this is moving over into using the database.query method, and a parameter with that method is setting in a string for the actual query that we want to run. Now this will work, this looks great, but where the dynamicness kind of comes into play is that we could actually add to this query just like we were adding into a string. Right, so we've got query plus equals and it's adding that industry in for us. Here's some of the dynamic binding that Salesforce already knows how to do, but in some cases you may even want to go the extremely old school way of doing escape characters and adding in, this will translate to banking, and adding in the value in here and using escape characters and all of that stuff. And I don't actually think we need escape characters in here. Let's just remove this, and I guess some of the dangers of using Copilot when you're working on things. So I'm going to save that, and we're literally just hard coding, right, the value that is coming through for banking, right? It's not being bound, but we're just treating it as a string and concatenating that string together. This will work, but you definitely open yourself up for things like SOQL injection. So you have to be wary of that as you're going through things. But just jumping back to our bind variables, we can kind of see how this becomes a lot easier, right? Instead of needing to do kind of this wild concatenation or anything like that, it's super easy to just add another value, maybe account industry, and we're going to pull that value in. And then we can also do this for the query as well. And what's really interesting about doing it this way is we could potentially dynamically build our where clause using the values that come from our query binds. So if you want me to build that out in the future, let me know. It would be super cool to kind of generate some of these query parameters and query strings on the fly as we're building out that where clause to be dynamic. One thing to take note with the query binds is that you can add bad binds in here. So I'm just going to write test and I don't know, do a couple of numbers in here, and this will actually execute fine. Let's jump over into here and execute our code again to see what we get. But we have not used this bind anywhere inside of our SOQL query, but it's smart enough to know, okay, the bind is not in here, even though we've passed in the bind map that we're working with. Even though we've passed it in, we're just going to ignore that. But one thing you should be wary of is if you add in a query for something that does not exist. So let's say that we remove this test in here, and this bind variable we're trying to set as we are going along. Let's execute this again. You can see I hit the little execute button, and we're running into an error, right? Because it's saying the key does not exist inside of the bind map. So just be aware of that. If you're using the bind variable in the query, then it needs to exist. And this is where some of that dynamic where clause generation tool would come in handy. And then really quickly, I just want to show some of the other with binds methods that exist. So there is the countQueryWithBinds, and this just returns an integer, really cool and can be very useful. Let's jump over and run this, and we should be seeing a number getting returned of 24. So we're using all of those same bind variables to then see an integer count. There is also the queryLocatorWithBinds, which is really great and useful for batch classes that you have created to run these bind queries. So we can kind of see an example here where we've set up our binds for the opportunity name. We've set up some wildcard filtering inside of our bind map based on the opportunity name. We've got our query set up and just a very simple bind going on inside of here. And then we are using the getQueryLocatorWithBinds, which is really great for batch classes that you want to set up these dynamic queries that you want to work with. QueryWithBind methods can be a bit advanced, but the more you use them, the more you'll start to see the power of them. If this was a bit advanced for you overall, kind of flying over your head, definitely check out Cloud Code Academy, where we bring you in and train you on Salesforce development. Once again, shout out to Lisa for calling this one out. And of course, you can find all of the code on GitHub. Let me know in the comments some of the ways that you have used the query-with-bind methods, and if you would like to see me build out that dynamic where clause generator. As always, I'm Walters954. Thanks so much for watching, and remember, I believe in you.